And so the first week commences. It is my habit to make a video each week discussing some aspect of the current module. This week we are exploring culture and identity, but the first discussion is where you introduce yourself and discuss what you think is the purpose or purposes of reading literature. Now, I know, in my esteemed opinion, having been a literature instructor for a very long time, that there is more than one purpose to reading literature and to writing literature. I will also say that one piece of literature can be interpreted in different ways and still have validity. I cover that somewhat in the written part of the announcement below. But however we interpret literature, we must support what it is that we say. Literature is highly subjective, and like any form of art. And how we look at literature and appreciate literature, and even the literature that we enjoy reading, depends upon our personal experiences and our perspectives. Now, note that I said reading, but I have a question for you. And it is a big overarching question. What is literature? And I will ask this in the discussion board as well. What makes literature literature? Can literature be defined as any written document? We talk about pamphlets we find in doctor's office as literature. But is that definition of literature different from the type that we are going to explore in this class? I also said reading literature, but I have a more important question even than what constitutes written literature. But is literature always written? I have asked students, and I'm asking you now, and I have asked people whom I know, what is literature? And almost always, not always, but almost always, they will say Literature is in written form. But I want to challenge this. Is literature not also related in oral traditions? You see, literature has been a facet of humanity since before writing was around. I cannot tell you when the first humans sat around a campfire and exchanged stories, but I bet it wasn't too long after they developed a language. And the first extant piece of literature is from Sumeria, and it is the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it's circa probably about 2000 BCE, and is based on the life of a real king, Gilgamesh, who lived circa 2700 BCE. So it was about anywhere from 500 to 700 years before his story was written, and there could be no doubt, absolutely none, that it was repeated orally before it was written. And it grew in the telling, because in the written epic, some fantastical things happen to Gilgamesh that I'm pretty sure didn't happen to him in real life. But if we say only written works are literature, when did the Epic of Gilgamesh, being handed down orally for hundreds of years, make the transference from oral to written, from non-literature to literature? That doesn't make sense to me. So when I define literature, I define it as oral traditions as well, which also leads to another question. Are movies literature? Are TV shows literature? Drama, stage plays, are always taught in literature courses. Well, they're taught in drama courses, but we're talking about literature here. So if drama is literature, why? Is it literature because there is a script? Or is it literature because it fits the purposes, which I'm going to get to in a minute, of literature? And if we accept drama as literature, and drama was written to be staged, drama was not written to be read. But if drama is literature, then why aren't movies literature? They have screenplays. Why are TV shows not literature? Because are they not written before they are performed? Of course, there are different degrees of snobbishness when it comes to literature, just like there is with other type of art, with visual art. I do not care for velvet paintings of Elvis. But my cousin had one above her mantle for a long time. And who am I to tell her, hey, you got a piece of trash art hanging up there? And the same thing with literature. I'm a poetry snob. Greeting card verse, get it out of my face. I want poetry to be deep and symbolic, and I have to read it several times in order to understand it. But other people are not poetry snobs, and they will accept simple poetry, and I'm using the word simple kind of sarcastically there, but they will accept other types of poetry as literature or great literature, or maybe just because they enjoy it. For example, I've never seen a purple cow, I hope to never be one. Well, that's a poem, but is it great literature? So literature is subjective. It is interpreted subjectively, and we all enjoy different kinds of literature as well as visual arts and so on. Back to the purposes of literature, though. Why should we read literature? And what is its purpose is? I see purpose of literature being, I won't say that there's a plethora of purposes, but there's certainly more than one. And I really don't want to give away those purposes because I might be stealing somebody's thunder. But originally, going back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, it was to record literature, poetry, and poetry was the first form of literature for a couple of reasons, but it was intended to convey history. So reading the Epic of Gilgamesh in Sumeria was reading the history of one of their kings. Yes, it was embroidered and elaborated, but did they know that, or did they care? So it was a historical account. You ever sat through a boring history lecture in a classroom? Boy, I have. And so literature was also then made to entertain, because we're going to listen to something that entertains us or read something that entertains us much more with much more happiness for enjoyment. That's the word I want. Than something that is very dry and boring and staid, and who wants to read or listen to that type of thing, for lack of a better word. So one purpose of history that you, or literature that you might not think of, was to record history. And it's very difficult for me not to say more, but I'm not, because again, I don't want to steal anybody's thunder, and we will discuss it in the discussion, and I will give my take on that after the class has finished discussing what they think the purposes are. Now, I said that Gilgamesh was a historical account, and I said that poetry is the oldest form of literature, and there is a reason why. Because poetry, most simply said, is easier to remember, and in oral traditions, you needed to be able to remember the story in order to tell it. And I can prove this to you easily on a couple of levels. Think of how many songs you know by heart. Now think of how many parts of songs that you know. I can hear a song from, I'm old, from 40 years ago that I haven't heard for 40 years, and I can sing it almost verbatim. Now, how many poems not set to music, and that's all songs are poems set to music. How many poems not set to music can you recite? Maybe you can recite a few, and maybe, I never saw a purple cow, or it might be one of them, but not nearly as many as songs that you can recall. Now, when I was in 8th grade, this is a personal aside, and I promised myself I wasn't going to get on bunny trails, but here I go. When I was in 8th grade, my 8th grade teacher, Miss Asta Colberg, gave us some poems to memorize every month, and then we would recite them in class. And I always wanted to be first to recite the poem, and usually I was. I can remember some of those poems. I can remember Robert Frost stopping by woods on a snowy evening, and I can still recount that. But I can sing a lot more songs that I heard in 8th grade than I can recite poetry. So that is one reason why poetry was developed, was to help the speaker remember the words. And the poetry was set to music. Ancient poetry is very much like children's literature of today, in that it rhymed and it is very repetitive. And again, I'm going to hold back and not go into that because this video is already 11 minutes long, and it would be an hour long if I went off on everything that I want to discuss. So I'm going to stop, and I am going to say, think about the purpose of literature. Is literature purely entertainment, or is it more? When we read something like Orwell's Animal Farm, is that just for entertainment? What are we supposed to gather? What is the purpose of a novel like that? All right, I really am stopping, and we will discuss some more of these aspects in the discussion board. And happy first week. Your assignments are discussed in the written part of the announcement below, and I am excited to be in this class. And even if you're not excited right now, I hope that you will be excited as the class progresses.